Hello and welcome to the Mike's DIY Tips channel on YouTube. I'm Mike, and in this video I want to show you various ways of bending small metal items. You may think that you haven't got the ability or the tools to do it, but I can show you several tricks whereby you can achieve your objective with minimum tools and know-how. I'm going to start with half a dozen examples of various metal bending tasks that you could be faced with. Then I'll move on to showing you the tools and techniques that have enabled me to successfully bend all sorts of different metal objects over the years. Final example is my toolbox, where each drawer is constructed with a thin sheet aluminium bottom curled up there and curled up there with a radiused corner. I want to bend this piece of aluminium sheet at 90 degrees. So here's a simple way. Two pieces of wood screwed together. Put the piece of aluminium in the wood, tighten up. Now, I'm just going to use brute force, but I want a nice square edge, which I've got there, but I haven't got here because over the years my bench has got rounded off. So I'm going to use this sharp edge here, and I'm going to press down with my left hand at the same time as lifting up with my right hand. The main thing is to keep the pressure on this point here, to keep this nice and straight. If you put the pressure on there, the whole thing will bend in a curve. I was able to put this piece of aluminium into the slot between the wood because the aluminium only came down to here. But what about if you got a long leg on the piece of aluminium, it comes right down here, then we couldn't use that screw. So we put a couple of clamps on instead, and then you can bend in the way that I showed you, like that. An alternative way, if you're lucky enough to have a joiner's bench vise like this, is to put your piece of metal in there with the line just showing, and then get a piece of wood like that, and tilt it slightly. As I said before, we want the pressure on there, not on the tip here. So as the metal bends, so I am raising up the timber to keep the pressure on this point here. That's because that's where the bend is. A restriction when using the joiner's vise with the wooden jaws is that if you bend metal 2 or 3 times, you will bruise the nice sharp corner of the wooden jaw. The other restriction is if you're trying to bend something with a deep leg like that, the vise isn't deep enough because of these metal support bars. However, if you're working on something narrow, you can use the end of the vise, and then you haven't got that restriction here, so effectively you could have a long piece of metal going right down to the floor. An alternative then is to use an engineer's vise like this, but the same technique. Keep tilting the piece of wood as the metal bends. Don't be tempted to hit with the hammer, because you can only hit with the hammer in one place, and if you're hitting any width at all, you're likely to get kinks in the metal. This way we're trying to keep the metal dead straight. Just as with the joiner's vise, you've got a restriction on that depth there. You can't go any deeper, and there isn't much room at the side to go right down unless you're using a very slender piece of metal. You saw me bending this piece of aluminium sheet. It's about 1.5 millimeters thick. If we were bending mild steel, we might not be able to bend quite the same thickness because steel is tougher than aluminium. Now with aluminium in particular, most of the sheet aluminium you'll come across, you should be able to bend it. However, some, it's made very stiff in the manufacturing process, and if you try to bend it, you could find that it'll fracture along there and the whole thing be very weak indeed. And there's no easy way of telling whether the metal you've got will do that. The only way to test it is to try it. Different metals like copper, brass, mild steel, aluminium, they've all got different properties and all a different resistance to bending, and you can only bend up to a certain thickness and a certain length. If you've got a shorter length, you might be able to bend a thicker piece of metal, or if you want to bend a long piece like that, for example, then the metal itself needs to be thinner to enable you to do it by hand. This is an example of bending a piece of mild steel which is about 1 millimeter thick, and let's say we want to bend it on that line there, and you've got minimum tools, so I'm going to use pliers. So setting the pliers just short of the line to allow for the metal to bend, I'm going to use the same technique, bearing down with my left hand and lifting up with the right. Doing it by hand like that, it's more difficult. You get more of a radius bend instead of a sharp right angle bend, but that would still do its job as a bracket. And if it's a bracket, you probably want to drill holes. Now, if those holes have got to marry up exactly with whatever you're fitting it to, I strongly recommend do the bend first and drill the holes afterwards. If you try and drill the holes first, there's a good chance they'll be in the wrong position when you've bent the metal. And so now we're going to do a demo of the bending. And I hope you can see those two lines. I'm going to do one line as a sharp 90-degree angle and the other one as a slightly radiused angle. The bending method I'm going to use is an extension of this idea where we put the metal in there and bent it up. So in this case we're going to sandwich the metal between two pieces of wood and then rotate the whole lot, as you'll see in a moment. So I'm all set up. There's my line just in view down the edge of the wood. The metal's going to bend up this way because I'm going to rotate that way. The clamps clamp the two pieces of wood together and also act as handles. So there you are, we've done the bend, but as you can see that is more than 90 degrees. So that needs closing up a bit more to give us our 90. Because it's soft aluminium, we can do it by hand. And I hope you can see that's a pretty neat bend in there. Now we're going to do this to the radius. So I'm set up again for my radius bend, and this time I'm going to be rolling that way, like that. I can just see my line consistently all along the edge of the wood. The piece of wood underneath is set back slightly because it's a radius corner. I turned it round because the handle of the clamp was stopping me from rolling all the way that way, so I've turned it round to be able to roll this way. Now, although I put that extra angle on, but as you can see we've got quite a neat radius, and it's very consistent all the way up. So what we can do is very carefully by hand just encourage it to bend a little bit more. That's much better. It's very thin and very soft aluminium, and it allows us to do that. If you had thicker aluminium or more stiff aluminium, you might not be able to do it by hand in the way that I've shown. So far we've endeavoured to bend sheet metal without putting any scratches or blemishes on the surface. But if you haven't got certain tools, or you want to achieve a certain kind of bend, you might have to resort to the hammer. Now here I'm going to try and bend that edge downwards according to the line. So just gently tapping, slowly going, just going offline slightly, but as you can see we're getting somewhere. So different things are achievable depending what tools you've got and what technique you use. Now by complete contrast I'm going to show you some really heavy metal bashing. This is perforated galvanised mild steel strapping, as widely used in the building trade for anchoring timber members to the brickwork. But it makes a very good general purpose bracket. It's 5mm thick and it's quite hard work to bend. So anyway, I'm just going to set it up in the vise, and I'm afraid you really do need an engineer's vise for this, as you'll see. So I'm going to hit it here. If I hit up here I'm going to get a lot of bounce, and a lot of the energy from the hammer blow will be lost in the bounce, so I need to hit it down there. I'm also going to pull this way with my hand to tension the metal all the time to try and stop the vibration. So there we are. I should point out that I did do the bend where one of the holes was. If you try and bend metal between holes or very near a hole, it will always try and bend at the weakest point, which is where the hole is. We're now moving on to the subject of bending wire. This is a good example of a useful thing you can make out of wire. It's a door restraining hook, otherwise known as a cabin hook. This one is made out of 3mm galvanised garden wire, and it's fairly straightforward to make if you've got some tools, and you will need a vise, as I'll show you now. So a piece of wire is ready, and I've done a crude diagram of the full size profile of the hook that we want. So I'm laying the wire on there, allowing a generous length there and a generous length here. So at that point there, I'm just going to bend the wire to give me that first bend there. I've got the copper tube set up in the vise and it's pinching the wire there. And now I'm going to wrap the wire around the copper tube. I've wrapped the wire around the copper tube, but as you can see it's badly out of alignment, but we can sort that out in a minute. I'll need to cut that off at a suitable point and then squash the two halves in together. So I'm squeezing with the vise to bring the two halves together. This piece is out of alignment, so I'm just bending that across. Now I've got to cut that off there. So you can see what's happening now, it's all starting to come together. I need to leave that gap open so that we can thread this onto the hook eye that's projecting from the wall. So next I need to bend up there, keeping this eye horizontal. So hopefully you can see where we're going. I need to come round that bend there. I've set the tube up again, ready to bend the wire around to form that hook there. So here we go then. We're getting there, I just need to cut this off here now. So we need to file off that end there to make sure it's not dangerous. That's a bit cockeyed, so we'll straighten that up. Straighten that up as well. It's not an exact replica, but it will certainly do the job. There you are then, that was all about bending metal, and I hope you found a few useful tips in that video. If you like my videos, you can subscribe to my channel and get automatic notification of when new videos are launched. You can do that now by clicking on the circular icon appearing on the left of the screen. Otherwise, you can watch one of my other videos now by clicking on one of the rectangular icons. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll join us again very soon.